This is Don Pringle bringing you this week's edition of the United Nations Review. This week, the United Nations moved from agreement on one aspect of the arms race, the need for stopping nuclear testing, to the need for complete disarmament. Both the United States and the Soviet Union emphasized that the Cuban crisis and its resolution gives renewed urgency to disarmament efforts. And both President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev agree on this point. The lesson of the most grievous international crisis, which threatened the world with nuclear war, said the Soviet Union's Valerian Zorin, is that the danger of such a war must be removed.
It is an unquestionable fact that if the removal of the threat of nuclear war is desired at the first stage, and this is what the situation today in the world insistently demands, then the liquidation of military bases on foreign soil and the withdrawal of troops from foreign soil is the most necessary condition for the achievement of this end. It should be noted that the Soviet draft resolution provides for the establishment of effective international control over the implementation of all measures of disarmament from beginning to end.
The United States replied through Ambassador Arthur Dean. Mr. Zorin's proposal, he said, would amount to the unilateral disarmament of the West, leaving the Soviet Union in a dominant military position.
The Soviet Union advocates a first-stage disarmament program which affects primarily all nuclear delivery systems and the elimination of all foreign bases. This would virtually force the United States to terminate all of its alliances and would give a major and tremendous advantage to the Soviet Union with its vast land area on the globe.
The 18-nation Disarmament Commission resumes its meetings in Geneva on November 12th. Without a dissenting vote, the General Assembly this week called on the major powers to end nuclear testing by January 1st. 37 non-aligned nations originally sponsored the resolution, which asks that tests in the air, the seas, and outer space be stopped, even if a comprehensive ban cannot now be agreed upon by the nuclear powers. The Assembly also called for an interim suspension of underground tests with effective international control. The Swedish delegate, Mrs. Alva Myrdal, spoke of the gap between East and West on the issue of nuclear testing and said it has apparently been narrowed.
There is, in essence, very little left of any arguments against a test ban. There is no major practical or technical objection standing in its way. The time to conclude all series of tests is now. If, despite this, a test ban does not materialize, we know that the reasons for non-action are political.
The representative of Czechoslovakia agreed with much of what Mrs. Myrdal had to say. But in Dr. Jiří Hajdak's thought, the Western powers were still dragging their feet.
The obstinate position of the Western powers, which continue rejecting the adoption of a reasonable compromise, contrasts profoundly with the sincere effort of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, as well as of an overwhelming majority of the non-aligned countries, aimed at the speedy conclusion of an agreement on the permanent cessation of all nuclear tests. The serious situation arisen in the past days has proved again the urgency of the adoption of effective measures preventing the danger of the nuclear war.
The Western powers' proposal laid more stress on the need for international control of underground tests. The Assembly approved their proposal, with the Soviet Union and 9 other countries voting no. Mr. Joseph Godber, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, felt that with a new approach to the problem, nations may still be able to solve their differences when the disarmament talks resume in Geneva.
I think our whole debate here has taken some time, but I think it has been valuable. It has, after all, produced a number of constructive contributions which we must certainly not lose sight of. I referred to some of them in my last intervention. It has also, I think, served to bring out clearly that although there is still a real gap separating the two sides, that gap is narrow. Now, the question which we have to consider at this moment is really what expression of view by this committee, endorsed as we would hope by the Assembly itself, what expression of view can best help in bridging the remaining gap?
During the week, the General Assembly denounced the policy of racial segregation of the government of South Africa and called for worldwide economic sanctions. The far-reaching resolution came first from the African Asian group in the Special Political Committee and was steered through the General Assembly intact, despite the efforts of some member states to take out the part about economic sanctions. The resolution calls on all UN member states to break off diplomatic relations with South Africa, to boycott all South African exports, to close ports and airfields to South African ships and aircraft. And as a last resort, if South Africa still fails to change its apartheid policies, the resolution asks the Security Council to consider expulsion from the United Nations membership. Approved by a two-thirds majority, the resolution was the sternest action ever taken by the United Nations against a member state. Mr. Eric Lowe, Foreign Minister of South Africa, defended the apartheid policies in his country.
What is the basis of South Africa's policy of separate and parallel development of whites and non-whites? The policy condemned in the resolution now before the Assembly, and on account of which imposition of sanctions is demanded. Sir, put briefly, it is the natural and elemental human urge to survive. Sir, the urge that is common to every nation represented in this Assembly. Sir, that is something which should be understood and appreciated by the white population of the North American countries, whose early history is similar to that of South Africa.
When Mr. Lowe tried to show a parallel between the United States and South Africa, he drew a sharp reply from United States Ambassador Francis Plimpton.
I should like to reject any comparison between the United States and the government of South Africa, such as the distinguished representative of that government has attempted to make. We reject apartheid. We believe that in the partnership of races and not in the separation of races lies man's best hope for a peaceful and successful society. To that end, Mr. President, we are using the most determined and the best of our efforts.
Mr. Lowe warned the Assembly against applying sanctions. The non-whites in his country, he said, had a better life and a higher standard of living than in many of the countries urging sanctions.
Mr. Chairman, I must warn this Assembly that member states who support this resolution will be helping to create a very dangerous precedent. A precedent which at some time in the future may react on some of them. Mr. President, paragraph 8 of the resolution before the Assembly envisages the expulsion of South Africa from the Republic of South Africa from the United Nations. Sir, I will say no more that once the United Nations starts expelling member states, that will be the beginning and the end of the United Nations.
To this point, and to the argument that economic sanctions would harm the victims of apartheid as much as those who impose it, Ghana replied, in the words of Mr. J.E. Jantois, one of the sponsors of the original sanctions resolution.
I'm afraid that Mr. Lowe's intervention this morning has done more harm than good to his cause. We in Africa think and believe that Africa has room enough for everybody. We in Africa have not the slightest desire to chase anyone from Africa. But we in Africa think that every person that comes to Africa to settle there must be accepted on one condition, and only one condition, that it recognizes the African, the peoples he meets there, as his equal, and as dignified enough to sit in council with him.
Across United Nations Plaza, the flag flew at half-mast atop the United States mission to the United Nations, a respectful tribute to the memory of Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, whose death this week is mourned by the millions in many nations. She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson said at her death, and her glow warmed the world. Among the messages from United Nations officials, this tribute from Mohammad Zafrullah Khan, President of the General Assembly.
Mrs. Roosevelt had, through many years, occupied a prominent position not only in the national life of the United States of America, but also in the United Nations. Despite failing health during the last years of her life, she continued to work devotedly and untiringly for many humanitarian causes till the end. She represented a certain tradition in American life which will be considerably weakened by her passing away.
In the meeting rooms at United Nations, delegates from every part of the world spoke intense feeling for the memory of the woman who had worked unceasingly for human rights. From a colleague as well as a friend, Dr. Ralph Bunch.
In the death of Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the world has lost perhaps its greatest, certainly its finest lady, and one of the noblest persons of our times. She was a symbol of goodness and of profound faith in man's goodness and in his potentiality. She was a beacon of hope and of promise for all of those throughout the world who are underprivileged and discriminated against, oppressed and victimized by forces of prejudice and greed. There has been no more implacable foe of bigotry, no stauncher defender of human rights.
In a note to the Roosevelt family, U Thant, acting Secretary General, said, Mrs. Roosevelt was truly the First Lady of the world, and we in the United Nations salute her memory for her warm humanitarianism and for her deep concern for the underprivileged. This is Don Pringle of the United Nations. This is National Educational Television.